Good morning, Dr. Goodwin. Thank you for joining us today.
Happy to.
So do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
So I am currently a professor at North Carolina State University, which is a big ag and engineering school here in the United States. So a lot of my research focuses now on how scientists argue in the public sphere. And since I'm a professor, I probably don't have much personal life, but I am a maker. And so I do a variety of crafts, including right now, of course, making cloth face masks for family and friends and students. I'm going to give them to my students when we get back together next semester.
Very cool. Are you all going to be teaching in person?
We're supposed to be kind of hybrid,
Yeah.
but I think everything's up in the air to the point where I'm going to be ready for anything. And I'd encourage everyone else to act the same way for about the next year. It's my suspicion.
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell me a little bit about how you came to study argumentation?
I think like a lot of people that end up in the field, I was labeled as argumentative when I was a kid. I only did debate for 1 year in high school in 9th grade, but I did like to argue. I was lucky enough to have some training in classical rhetoric during my college years. And then I actually went to law school, mostly because I thought I would be able to argue a lot when I was in law school. And I was right. I could. And I actually found that the rhetoric training that I'd had served very well in law school. The law faculty, when they gave an exam, they didn't care so much about showing your knowledge of the law. All my fellow students were sitting and memorizing all sorts of legal principles. I memorized the main arguments in any particular subject, and I managed to do fairly well with less preparation perhaps than those other people. So then after practicing for a while, I went back to graduate school in rhetoric. And although my program didn't have any courses on argumentation, I did some independent work on argumentation. And when I found a community of friendly scholars pretty soon after I graduated, I kind of put almost all of my scholarly work in that bucket, going and really focusing highly on argumentation.
Excellent. And so can you tell me a little bit about where you actually studied and with who?
So I studied at the university. The PhD program was the University of Wisconsin-Madison. At the time, Ed Black, very names that should be known to anyone that studied in rhetoric in the communication discipline. Ed Black, Steve Lucas, Lloyd Bitzer. Also there was a former student who was still in the neighborhood teaching named Fred Caulfield, and I think I probably learned more from him than from anyone, even though he wasn't ever formally a teacher of mine.
Awesome. Yeah, that's where a lot of normative pragmatic theory, which I think we'll probably get to in a moment, comes from.
From Fred, yeah.
Yeah. What would you say most broadly the study of argumentation offers society?
So honestly, I think the main thing it offers is that it increases our sense of the complexity of the world. Like we understand better how complicated everybody can make arguments in their daily life, or if you're on Twitter or Reddit, you're making arguments. It's easy. Okay, you may want to get better at it, but that just takes a little practice. Actually, those things that you're doing are really, really complicated. We don't even half understand them. And increasing the complexity of the world, increasing our sense that the world is really complex, and increasing slightly our understanding of that is, I think, the main thing. It does, so I'm not even going to claim social benefits. It does, though, argumentation studies has social benefits in the sense that it's just a surprising fact that when people disagree about really, really important things, they start making arguments to each other. They could do other things. They could write poems.
Yeah.
Right? They could tell personal stories. they could do all sorts of things, but instead we seem to use argument in these contexts that are both emotional because there's a lot of disagreement, and important because something vital to our perhaps survival is being discussed, and we start making arguments. So maybe if we understood how people make arguments and what arguments can do and how they can be assessed, then we could do those things better.
That totally makes sense. So we're understanding how complicated things like democracy are, right? That they're messy, and that's sort of what we live in, even in non-democracies, right? Just to live is a messy thing amongst other people.
Yeah, messy, but not totally chaotic. So complexity is, it's not simple, right? So there's no easy answers, but there are answers.
Right.
It's not just whatever.
So I kind of, answered this a little bit before, but can you tell me what your approach to argumentation is?
Like the
what would you
name
call
of it?
your generic approach to argumentation?
Okay, so that names of approaches are useful to help sort out the ways different people do work.
Yeah.
So I don't think it has much use beyond that. It's just like it's helpful to say, oh, these two people they're like members of the same family. Their work resembles each other.
Yeah.
I'm in the family that some family members want to call the family normative pragmatics. I'm pretty happy with that. It suggests that we're studying argument because it gets things done. It's pragmatic or practical, and also it's normative. You can do it better or worse. Those are serious judgments.
Yeah.
Other members of the family kind of like to call it the design approach. I like that too because that emphasizes that whatever arguments are, they're things that we make, and there's a lot of, we're responsible for designing them. They don't just happen. So the design, the word design approach stresses the human competence and responsibility for this activity.
Okay. Can we narrow in on the word pragmatics for a minute? Because I know that's a term that the people listening might have heard before. Do you use the word pragmatics in a similar way that, say, the pragmadialecticians might use it?
Sure. It's actually, so pragmatics is actually a branch of linguistics.
Yeah.
The study of language in general has, you can study the syntax, you can study words, morphemics, you can study phonology, sounds, there's all sorts of stuff. Language is complex, right?
Yeah.
So there's sorts of things to study. Pragmatics is usually seen as the general, the study of language use, how we get things done using language. So that's one of the meanings of pragmatic. It refers to a specific scholarly discipline. And in general, the word comes from the Greek word for action, and it means getting things done.
Yeah, the ordinary practice of getting things done. Yeah, I like that. So what would you what is an argument then? So I heard you say some things that aren't arguments a moment ago. Poems are not an argument. So what is an argument?
So we had a little prior chat about this. I'm not convinced that asking the question, what is an argument, is all that great a question, because I think the English language has a pretty definite meaning for the word argument. It means two different things. Argument one is a claim that's supported by a reason. And argument two is when we have, that's the argument. Argument one is the arguments that we make. We make an argument, we put out a claim, and we support it with reasons. Argument two is two people having a disagreement. They're arguing. Those are the arguments that we have. And English is pretty open about that. I don't think that there's a lot of confusion. Now, instead of asking what is an argument, I think it's better to ask, what is there to study that's interesting around argument? So one thing to study is the arguments themselves. Do they come in different kinds? Are like example arguments versus causal arguments? Are some arguments fallacies? So you could study different kinds of bad arguments.
Yeah.
So you could study arguments. You can study how people make arguments. That is, how they take these reasons and claims and actually put them into language. That goes very much in the direction of rhetoric. Like, what words do you use? Do you soften the argument, or do you actually kind of make it more aggressive? All of those things start becoming objects of attention if you think about how people make arguments. Then, okay, that's not, there's still other things. Usually we don't make arguments just on our own. We're talking to somebody else or several other people. And so we're involved in some kind of argumentative interaction where I make some arguments, you respond, I think about it, I go back, some third party walks in and they start making totally different arguments. So how do these interactions work? That's actually one of the primary things I study, because these interactions have this fundamental weird quality, which is we're interacting, but we totally disagree.
Right.
Like, why are we fighting? Why are we ignoring each other?
Right.
There's all sorts of things. Somehow we're agreeing about almost everything, maybe, like Democrats and Republicans right now, but we still manage to exchange arguments with each other. How does that happen? What kinds of things have to be true in the world? What can we do to make it happen more, or to make it happen better?
Well, it strikes
I got
me.
one more. Let me get in the last level. So, okay,
Yeah.
we got arguments, making arguments. We can study that. Argumentative interactions with multiple people. And then we can actually study argument systems, which is the large bodies. It goes beyond argumentative interactions. If, like, you're on Twitter, there's all sorts of arguments that are just kind of circulating. So this kind of very high level study of how argument works in the public sphere, where we have thousands and millions of arguers making arguments over and over again, that also can be studied. So,
oh my gosh, like the meta system is incredible what we have access to, because I think on that last point, sort of is something we've never really had access to in any point in history, based on the sort of technology we've had and the ability to grasp, right? Like, it's
yes.
at one moment.
So I agree. Right now, I think that argument at the system level, that study is opened up by the fact that the discourse exists. I mean, people have always been arguing with each other nonstop, but now they're doing it on Twitter, which is actually saved up somewhere, so that the conversations that maybe used to be in the barber shop or the coffee shop or just between relatives, they're now all written down, and they're stored and we can get access. So first, the data exists.
Yeah, it's
and then second, we increasingly have analytic tools that allow us to not have to read every single one of a million tweets.
Yeah, which is
automatically analyze it.
It's crazy. I mean, in the sort of data that yields. I know we were both just attended a conference, the first online conference in light of the pandemic, and got to see this incredible presentation from Dr. Jackson, someone we'll interview later, about sort of the systems analysis of debates about, wait, I'm telling you about your own presentation about anti-vaxxers, and they're all melded together.
No, that was Sally Jackson's presentation. I also presented on a similar topic about climate change.
About climate change, about if climate change should fly, if climate activists, but you were doing systems work too.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, and I was just sort of taken aback by sort of how much the way you could trace all the argument trees and all the sites of stasis and the overlap. I thought that was incredible. You talked about, I forgot the Greek term. What was it when you can use the premise of somebody else's argument again?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's I don't know a Greek term, but you just you steal the other side's best argument and you show that it really works for you.
Yeah. What was that? Yeah, that was incredible. Maybe we could talk about that in a minute. I'm getting off topic. I'd love that. Clearly, I love that presentation, and they're all mixing in my head and my pandemic brain.
That's fine. The main point is that as people that want to study argumentation, we can study asking the question, what is an argument, is too limiting. What is an argument? What is making an argument? What happens in argumentative transactions, and what's happening at the system level? I think all of those are really cool questions that we should be asking.
So for me, this then raises another question. How do you identify as a critic when any of those things have occurred that you've just listed?
Yeah. How do you do it in normal life, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we seem to be able to do it, right?
Yeah.
So why is it that hard?
So if I'm hearing you say, one of the things, like one of the premises of argumentation is this idea of, and I've talked about this earlier in the class, intersubjective validity. You know you're in an argument because you know you're in an argument, right?
Yeah, I strongly think that argumentation studies should start with our ordinary capacity to make arguments. So I don't think of argumentation theory is not like a lawgiver. It doesn't tell us how to do things. It helps us understand what we are already doing and explains to us why it works or doesn't work in allowing us to get better. But it does not, it takes our intuitive knowledge, like, you know how to drive, but could you tell somebody how to drive if they came from Mongolia, they'd never driven before? Like, could you explain how to drive? Probably not. So our knowledge of argument is like our knowledge of driving. It's intuitive. It's a intuitive, practical knowledge. Point of argumentation theory is to take that knowledge and make it explicit, and to make sure it's true. Like, maybe people are not driving all that well, and if we really study driving, we could help them drive better. Which, in fact, there's people that research driving, right? And that's their point. So argumentation theory is not something separate from normal practice. So I think the better question is, how do people really recognize, if you're going along and somebody says something, how do you manage to recognize that it's an argument? Because we do that routinely. And there's some theories on how that happens.
Right, yeah, exactly. So after you've identified, we come upon an argument where you're like, oh, this seems like an argument to me. How do you go about start methodologically analyzing? Because a lot of the time arguments aren't always explicit, right?
Okay, so that's the problem of how to reconstruct an argument. So now we're talking, remember I said there's like these 4 levels. Now we're talking down at that base level. Just what is the argument? Somebody said something and we're trying to pull the argument out of it. Is that?
Yeah, and let's talk about it at those different levels. Like, how would you go about starting to, we're going to get to the evaluation question in a minute. You've got these different levels. How would you start analyzing at these different levels that you've talked about?
So each different level has different problems and different kinds of theories are applicable to it. At the argument, if an argument is a set of reasons for a claim, then the key kind of theory that we need is a theory of inference. Why the fact that an expert says something means that it's true. Like, why? So my work doesn't go in that direction. That's more the informal logic people look at that. But if you're saying, so I study more making arguments and argumentative interactions. And there we start with, the communication discipline has large numbers of methods for analyzing messages and interactions. And so I start there. There's methods, and there's methods that range from really, really close up, like you analyze every word, or even beyond words. You transcribe what a person is saying, and you get in all the pauses, all the little things where they change their mind partway through,
Yeah.
right? Real talk is quite complex. So there's methods in the communication discipline where you make sure that you capture all of that, everything that's happening when people talk, intonation, emphasis in voice, whatever, body language,
Right.
right? Whatever's there, there's communication methods. There's methods in the communication discipline for studying it. Same is true with interactions. We capture what both sides are saying, and we look at how that relates, how they're relating to each other. So we can either look really close up at microscopic features, or sometimes we can step back and sort of look at it in the big picture and look for repeated themes over a large body of discourse. I don't think that argumentation studies has its own set of methods. I think that it's a very interdisciplinary endeavor, and we all bring methods from our different fields. I'm in communication, so I bring communication-based methods.
Yeah. So one of the things that I know a lot of the people watching these videos are going to hear is a difference between, are going to hear people coming from like rhetoric, for example, in communication. Would you say that you identify as separate from rhetoricians, or are you rhetoric plus, or just when you say calm, the same as rhetoricians?
I'm not, I don't think, I'm definitely trained as a rhetorician, and my sensibilities are highly rhetorical. And I'm not trying to get over that, but we're in a period in the whole, across the whole academy, of methodological ferment. And I don't think that walling yourself off into a little discipline like rhetoric is really a great way to keep learning and growing. So I find a lot of kinship and overlap with with other colleagues in communication who wouldn't use the word rhetoric to describe their work at all. But anybody that's looking closely at what people really say, those people I think of as, I can learn a lot from them.
Yeah.
And we can talk with each other. Is that everyone in communication? No, there's plenty of communication work that is more experimental.
Yeah.
Like you lock people in a room and you expose them to a message and you see what happens.
Yeah.
That's farther from what I do, and I although I read that kind of work, I don't really see myself as contributing to it all that much.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sometimes I don't know whether your students will be familiar with the terminology, but it's like quantitative methods versus qualitative methods. So
you're more in
I think, rhetoric fits very well into qualitative methods.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. So how you identify these different arguments or argument systems or making an argument, how do you determine the quality? Because you said the other half of normative pragmatics is the normative. How do you determine what is good?
So going back to what I said about argumentation theory, is what we really study is what ordinary people are already able to do. I think that we have, so a first step is to find out what regular arguers think is good or bad, right? In ordinary argumentative practice, we very, very frequently criticize each other. We say, that's a bad argument.
Right.
Or, you're trying to shut me up. I don't like, that's bad. You should not do that. That's a bad move in our conversation. You shouldn't shut me up. I have the right to speak. So there's already plenty of normativity in the way that we normally practice argument. And I think that a first step in doing the normative part of normative pragmatics is to take that seriously and find out the ways people are critiquing each other and defending themselves. To find out the normativity that's already there in our regular argumentative practice, and there is a lot of it, and to understand it better. So that's a first thing. The second thing is, I think that normativity is, it may be less about being all judgy, like that's good, that's bad, like being the school marm of argument. The
Yeah.
person, naughty, naughty, taking out your red pen and like circling everybody's argument and saying, that's an F, that's an F. um, Maybe normativity is better thought of as, how can I make the world a better place? So it's not something that we do in analyzing, it's something that we do in making. So part of the interest in studying argumentative transactions is that how can we interact with what can I do as an arguer to help other people see reason?
Yeah.
To make the situation between the two of us a better situation, so that the person I'm arguing with listens to what I'm saying, thinks about it, and because I'm pretty confident if somebody listens to my arguments fairly and thinks about them, they're going to come to the same opinion as me, at least in the long run. So a normative perspective says, what are the tools that we have for making our argumentative interactions better?
Right.
That's a little different than this judgy idea of just going around and telling other people that they're bad.
Yeah. So it's less a moral standard, right, in terms of good, badness, but it's more of a practical standard of making things along the pragmatic definition.
It's making, because pragmatics, the idea really is to make the argument interaction one that is better. I mean, so there are normative standards there. It's not just an argumentative interaction where I win.
Right.
Which could have no
I'm saying
normative standards.
the normative standards are tied to enhancing the argumentative encounter, less the morality of what is right versus wrong.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. So could you give us an example of how you would look at a case of argumentation? Like, could you give an extended example?
Can I give an example? What do you want this example to exhibit?
Just perhaps you could talk about if climate scientists could fly.
Okay, so here's something that I just wrote about on the blog.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of general point that I'd like to make to arguers overall, particularly in our hyper-partisan world. It's very easy to think in these highly polarized arguments in the public sphere: abortion, climate change, wearing masks during the pandemic. These arguments, these issues have become tribalized, and there's a lot of, we really hate the other side. We're convinced that we're right. We hate the other side. We think that giving in is going to result in the end of the world. And we really want to destroy the other side. So it's very common in these situations to perceive that when somebody from the other side makes an argument, they're doing it in bad faith. Like if a rich person makes an argument, they're just doing it because they want to get more money. Or when a climate skeptic makes an argument, they really don't. They're not in good faith. They're gonna beat on climate scientists no matter what. So you can't really, if a person's in bad faith, you can't really argue with them, right? That's the argumentative interaction doesn't go well when one person is sincerely trying to present arguments and the other person is not in good faith. They're there for some other reason than to make arguments. So here's the problem. I don't think we should ever think that the other side is in bad faith. I think we need to just give up that thought. There's a variety of reasons that I think so. One is that it's usually just false. Most normal, there may be, there's some lobbyists and some political hacks that are just making arguments to make money and to have power and things like that. But most ordinary people you meet really do believe what they're telling you, and are really trying to present arguments that they think are good arguments. They're not in bad faith. Telling them that they're in bad faith, or in any way treating them like they're in bad faith, guess what? Does that make the polarization better or worse? Worse.
Yeah.
It's like, because it's so insulting. It's like it's a personal attack, and there's no way to keep talking with the person after you say you're in bad faith. you don't really mean any of that. That's just bullshit. You're really just trying to, impose a capitalism on me or impose communism on me or whatever. So it's false. It's not useful. And there's increasing research that suggests that we are not very good at understanding other people's points of view. We tend to judge the other side by the most extreme members as opposed to by the average members. And in particular, we're not very good at understanding what other people think of us. So they've done, there's a recently out set of surveys where they interviewed both Democrats and Republicans. And Democrats thought pretty highly of themselves and Republicans thought pretty highly of themselves. And they thought less highly of the others. But when asked, if you asked a Democrat, what does an average Republican think of you, a Democrat? It's like on a scale of liking 1 to 100, the Democrats thought that Republicans respected them about 20%.
Right.
In fact, it's several times higher than that. Okay, so we don't really hate each other as much as we think. So this is a key for argumentative interactions to proceed. For us to exchange reasons with each other at all, we got to give each other some basic trust. We got to trust that the other person is in bad faith. I can't make you treat me with good faith, but I can change what I think of you and how I treat you. And so I'm a big advocate within the climate change debate that climate scientists should drop the word denialist or denier. We should never use that word. It's stupid and it's false and it's not helpful, right? Mm-hmm. And instead, really try to treat every person they encounter with respect. Now, if a person is, if they're annoying you and acting badly, and like on Twitter, block them. Like you don't have to engage. But if you engage a person, engage them with respect and presume that they're in good faith. That's a lot of my most recent work that's what it's about.
No, I think that's really, really good advice. I think that the inclination right now is often to just deride the other side rather than engage them. And that just increases polarization because we just shut into our echo chambers where we just intensify our convictions and are willing to use reason to engage one another.
So another, there's like a new fallacy terms are invented all the time. Mm-hmm. One that I really like is nut picking. So nut picking is when you take the most stupid thing that the other side has ever done, like some extremist, and they do something utterly stupid, and you say and you publicize it, like you retweet it or you put it in your Facebook page. You take the other side's worst behavior and you amplify it. We got to stop doing that, right? So all that's, if you Facebook share, if you're a Democrat or progressive and you Facebook share the worst behavior of the Republican Party, you're making things worse. Don't do that. In fact, what you should do is find some Republicans that you can bear listening to and retweet them.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think if you should populate your feed with people that you disagree with often, and you should read people you disagree with often. One of the topics we often have is, should you unfollow people that offend you?
Yeah, and I'm a big fan. So to make arguments work, to make argumentative interactions work, you got to admit that a lot of times they're not going to work, and just don't go there, right? As opposed to go there and make it worse. If there's people that are saying revolting things, don't follow them, don't retweet them. But you should, that shouldn't be everyone on the other side. You should be able to find some people that you disagree with, but you respect the way that they're reasoning. And those people are worth following.
Yeah, I agree. So I think that's a great piece of advice. Do you have anything else you want to sort of convey to potential future argumentation scholars or critics?
Well, I would say stay empirical and respect the complexity of the practice that we are already engaged in.
Yeah, I think that's a really good bit of advice. I think that we should stay empirical and look at ordinary argument. And don't be scared of it. It seems like one of the things I think is really interesting is that argument, and I don't know if this is your experience of being in the field so long, is often thought of as a negative term when you say that you teach it. Out of curiosity, by the way, how often when you tell people you study argument, what are the canned responses you hear? Do you always hear like, oh, I don't want to argue with you?
Yeah, it could be. I usually don't, I'm not sure the word argument shows up in my short form of the way I explain my work to other people. I usually tell
really?
them I study scientists involved in controversies. That's a little broader. Yeah, okay, so the word argument does have this negative tone, and there's two ways that we can move forward.
Yeah.
One is to develop a theory saying, no, that's wrong, argument is good. Notice, though, that goes against my basic principle of respecting normal people.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of reasons. I mean, most of the negativity is, I think, justified. To go back to the beginning, we make arguments when we disagree. That's not comfortable.
Yeah.
It's hard to do. It does go wrong. So instead of, my preference is when people, instead of resisting the negativity of argument, it's like to say, yeah, we use argument to do some of the hardest things we can, and let's look at the other ways we could solve these problems. We could have a dictator.
Yeah.
Do you want to do? We could have a war. Argument it's like the Churchill's saying about democracy. It's like it's a bad form of government. It's just better than all the others. That's the only good thing that can be said. Argument it's hard, it's stressful. You find out that people disagree with you, even about things that you think are really important and close to your heart. It's kind of shocking to know that there's people that could disagree with some things. So I don't think we should run away from that. That's the way it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really good note to end on. Thank you very much for your time, Dr. Goodwin, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, good luck. Have fun.
Thanks. Cheers.